You at home, please let's share in this piece together. Okay, we're now going to have our readings. Thank you, Brian.
Good morning, everyone. Our first reading is from John 14, verses 15 to 21. Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever. This is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, because he abides with you, and he will be in you. I will not leave you orphaned. I am coming to you. In a little while the world will no longer see me, but you will see me, because I live. You also will live. On that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. They who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me, and those who love me will be loved by my Father, and I will love them and reveal myself to them." The second reading is from Acts chapter 17, verses 22 to 34. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inherit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though he indeed is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of our own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think of the deity as like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed the day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." At that point Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. And this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I'm just contemplating if I'm going to start where I think I'm going to start. Because what I'm about to say, I might get me into trouble, all right? Okay? I'm not always a fan of Paul. There, I've said it, all right? I don't always find Paul easy. I don't always find Paul's theology easy. And I know this might be a little out there, but I actually don't know. I actually think if Jesus and Paul had actually ever met, that Jesus might have had a good word with Paul about a few things, about his approach to a few things. You've got it, all right? But one of the things I really love about Paul One of the things I really admire about Paul is his ability to be contextual, is his ability to walk into different places and share a message that makes sense to the audience to whom he's speaking. He gets himself into some great conversations, or into some great lectures, might I say, because Paul was a Pharisee, so he was probably used to lecturing people. And that's where I want to start today, is this sense of contextual theology, which is what Paul is doing here. The idea of knowing who your audience is, to understand the setting, the political setting, the social setting, the philosophical setting. Context requires a whole range of things more than that. The social settings, the demographics, all those kind of things are all contribute to context. And in this case, and in this setting of Acts, Paul is out amongst the Gentiles. He's out past the borders of normal Judaism. Don't get me wrong, he often, and you'll see it in the book of Acts, he often encounters Jewish diasporas out there, like Jewish communities out in Gentile world. And he because he's a Pharisee, I presume, he often has this ability to get himself to speak in the synagogues. My guess is he only gets to speak once most of the time, because he probably makes a whole bunch of enemies while he's there, or people don't like his ideas. But that's where he is. He's out in the nether regions. And in our setting of our story today, Paul is in Athens. And leading into today's reading, he's been to the synagogue and he's been speaking. He's been to the marketplace and he has been speaking. And whilst at the marketplace, you can read this in the little passage before the one we picked up today, and whilst in the marketplace, there were two groups that he roused their kind of interest. One was the Epicureans, and the Epicureans were people who believed in pleasure but in moderation. They believed in pleasure like the hedonists, but their thought was it's more like the virtue is in being able to moderate pleasure, to not let pleasure take over all of who you are, that life was about pleasure. The other group were the Stoics, where they believed the true virtue of life was knowledge and reason and being able to hold an argument and hold your case and discuss it to its, till you've chewed the bone and the marrow and everything else that comes with it, right down to till there's nothing left. And these two groups of people were challenged by his teachings. So they said, in fact, how about you come along? Well, it says they took him to. So I don't know how much to say. It's hard to understand whether Paul was dragged or whether they strongly urged him to go. They thought his ideas were kind of either interesting enough or bizarre enough, but held together enough somehow that they took him up to the... Now, I'm going to struggle with this word or two, and someone else might know the correct pronunciation of Areopagus. The Areopagus, right? Areopagus, that's it, thank you. So yes, sorry, it was something I should have looked up before I got here. Who were kind of like this group of people who held the intellectual, philosophical, theological thoughts. They were kind of like the ruling council. In terms of, not in terms of political power, but in terms of thought power. It's a bit like the Sanhedrin in the Jewish context, where the Sanhedrin was this council that looked after the religious oversight of the people and held the power and made the decisions. And so made up of different thought schools of thought, but somehow holding it together. And that's who this group was. They didn't necessarily hold political authority, but they certainly held together the philosophical, theological, that kind of thought. So the context in which Paul's speaking and visiting and arguing and discussing and holding lectures and being opposed by, there's nothing new in any of this. Like Greek culture was, the Hellenistic culture was polytheistic. What I mean by that, like we would call ourselves a monotheistic faith. We have one God. We have the three in one God, but we're monotheistic. We have a triune God, but we believe in one God. Whereas, you'll know this from school. Like Greeks had a whole the pantheon. Yes. And so they had this whole. There were 12 main gods, and there were other gods as well. And they would build these altars and statues to all of the different gods. And they had this mythology around it too. All these stories about how the gods interacted and the conflicts and the peace and the interrelationship of all the gods. And somewhere in the middle of it all, while Paul's been walking around Athens, he's found this altar to the unknown God. And that's his entry point in. That's why I admire Paul's contextual theology. In a pluralistic, a polytheistic setting, many gods, many different faiths, many different people all in the one city, he's able to find a way in that makes sense to them. And he points out, you've got this altar to the unknown God. Now, this God might be unknown to you, but this God is known to me. It leads me to the question, what's our context? What are our roads into people's lives in our setting? You'll probably have your own thoughts about all that. And as I say, in a time, in my little note for news and notes, there was a time when Christendom was sort of like the dominant way of understanding life in Australian context. I've had these conversations with many of you. There was scripture in schools. The churches were full. Our Sunday schools were full. We couldn't get enough buildings. We couldn't get enough teachers. There were times when Christianity was was the filter through which most things happened in our culture. Now it's still. I'm not saying it's gone. I think you'll still find there's many things in our culture that still hold a Christian marinade in them, if you like. There's still a flavour of Christianity in a number of different systems in our society. But I think our culture has shifted in the last 50 years. Our context has shifted in the last 50 years dramatically. The trouble is that there are many Christians who haven't changed with it. There are many churches that haven't grasped or grappled with that change. And we still assume Australian society to be like it was 50 or 60 years ago. And it's not. And I think one of the greatest gifts that we can be as people of faith is not to assume that our faith makes sense to everybody or is for everyone. We're not on a world domination mission here. As I've said before, Jesus always said, we're meant to be salt and light. But I don't think Jesus ever envisaged that the whole meal would be salt. I think Jesus always knew that we would be a small undercurrent. Because it's a tough road being a Christian person. If you're living it the way that Jesus lays it out for us, it's a tough pathway to always choose the way of love in the face of what goes on in our world. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's not for those who get easily distracted by other ways of putting it together. So in our context and in our times, I don't know how you view, and it's not everybody. I know this, what I'm about to say isn't everybody. But the way we've chosen to order ourselves as a church and the way we've chosen to live God's mission in our part of the world. Most of us know that we're encountering people for whom the way the world is doesn't work because they feel lost. They feel rejected. They feel abandoned by God. They've had experience with the church that have kind of told them they're not good enough. That they're not good enough for God. That God's starting point with us is a wall, a barrier. We live in times that are post-Christian and where spirituality is held higher, as a higher order, if you like, than religion. I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily either, but that's kind of some of the context. We live in contexts where people have chosen atheism, where thinking has done away with God altogether. And I guess the question that sits for me is, in this kind of context, what does that mean for you and I, who are choosing to try and find the pathway of love and of life? We're trying to find God's pathway in the midst of all this. Because it's not an easy road, and it's not even a very clear path sometimes. And because you will encounter all kinds of people in your lives. Let's not just talk about what happens, in this building from Sunday to Saturday, or on this premises, or in our reach into the community. You live lives in the world where you're encountering all kinds of people. So what are the words? Like, how do we be, and as I shared in the news and notes, how do we be evangelical? How do we share good news in this kind of context? You've probably got used to my preaching by now, and you know where I'm going to go with this, don't you? Because I think the answer, for me anyway, is that I'm always going to turn to Jesus to try and see what he's sharing that fits in with our context. And Jesus speaking into his context. See, Jesus did have conversations, philosophical, theological conversations, but most of the Gospels tell us, like most of the stories in the Gospel tell us, that Jesus actually chose people without power, that Jesus chose to be with people who were on the edges, that Jesus didn't find as much value in arguing in the synagogue or in the marketplace as he did with being with those who were lost and abandoned, forsaken, for those for whom they'd been told by the religious power that they were outside of God's love or outside of God's commands and God's requirements. And in our reading this morning, our gospel reading this morning, Jesus is talking to his followers and he's saying, I'm soon going to be gone. In one sense, I'm going to be gone. But in another way, I am still going to be here. You're not going to be abandoned. You're not going to be left to your own devices. I am going to help you find that way. My Spirit will come and lead and guide you. And in what way will the Spirit lead and guide us? The answer, of course, is love. Love is the way that we are known. Love is our evangelical message, if you like. Love is what Jesus spoke into a world that was lost and abandoned and forsaken. Now, I'm not just talking about a philosophical, theological conversation about love. Because I actually quite like the call in this passage that Jesus makes to us is that it's about keeping the commandments. And of course, Jesus shared with us what the key commandments are. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength. To love your neighbour as you love yourself. And I think what Jesus is trying to say to us is that when we choose love, when we let love be the guide of the message we are trying to share, then God is revealed. God is seen. It's in this action of doing. I'm going to draw a little analogy for you. I wasn't going to, but I am going to do this. I want you to tell me at what point in my story you could identify me as a cyclist. All right? How do you know I'm a cyclist? Is it because I've read a whole lot of books about cycling? Is it because I watch the Tour de France every year? I don't, but let's assume I did watch the Tour. I watch parts of it, mostly for the scenery. But if I watch the Tour de France, does that make me a cyclist? If I wait at Ruby's Cafe down by the beach where all the cyclists go for a coffee on their way to and from, and sat around and had a bit of a chat to a few cyclists, am I a cyclist? Am I a cyclist if I go to the bike shop and buy lube from a chain and buy a Lycra, heaven forbid, and or if I buy all the right gear, am I a cyclist yet? Getting closer. What if I bought a bike? Does that make me a cyclist? Closer again, but I'm still not there. Exactly right. Okay, the point I become a cyclist is when I get on the bike and I start to pedal. It's the action that identifies me. It's the action that makes it known, makes my identity known as a cyclist, if I wanted to be known that way. Yeah? So let me just change that over a little bit. I don't think that's a bad analogy for who we are as faithful people. It's the way that God is revealed. We can talk about love all we like. We can put banners on the wall about love all we like. We can have a mission statement or a mission or whatever about love as much as we like. But love is not known until you and I choose to be loving people. It's in this action of love that God is known. It's this movement of love. It's in the acts of love. This is how the unknown God is revealed. This is how the unknown God becomes known in our context, when people like you and I choose to love. When we choose love as our light, as our beacon, as our way, as our pathway, God is seen, God is revealed, God is known. The Spirit will lead us and guide us in this way. We have to be awake to it, but we have to be prepared to move. And so that's where I just want to finish things today, is that my hope and my prayer for you is that God may become more known to you. If you're feeling like you don't know the love of God, if you're feeling a bit separated from it, if you're feeling a bit unsure or uncertain, then my encouragement to you is to try and find love and start cycling a little bit. Start moving the pedals a little bit. But even more so, my hope and my prayer and my challenge for you is that you might choose love over all else, because that's how the unknown God may well be revealed through you in our world today. Amen. We're going to sing a song called The Summons. We have sung this before, and it's a song that draws